Welcome to Unbreakable Truth. In today's video, I want to take you into a story that, at first glance, might seem ordinary, about meeting someone new, settling into a shared life, and adjusting to the people who come along with that. But beneath the surface, it became something far more complicated, layered with glances, silences, and the kind of tension that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. When I first met Greg, he was open about having a son. He didn't dwell on it much in the early days, just the casual mentions parents make when their children are part of the background rhythm of their lives. He's 20, doesn't know what he wants to do yet, Greg had said once, shaking his head with that mix of affection and mild frustration that only a parent can carry. I keep telling him he needs to start thinking about his future. But you know how kids are. I'd smiled politely, though I couldn't truly relate. I'd never had children. Never planned to. My life had been about my career, about building something that was mine, success, independence, freedom. Then Greg arrived, steady, charming, and unexpectedly grounding. With him, I found a kind of companionship I didn't know I'd been missing. 2 years passed before we moved in together. Until that point, Stuart was more of an abstract idea than a real presence in my life. I'd seen the occasional photo, grainy snapshots on Greg's phone of a tall young man with a confident grin. I'd heard stories at dinner about his failed college starts, his resistance to getting a job, his obsession with working out, and his love for expensive sneakers. None of that prepared me for the day I saw him in person. We had only been living in Greg's house for a few weeks. I was still getting used to the layout, the sounds, the feeling of it being ours rather than just his. One Saturday afternoon, I was unpacking groceries in the kitchen when the front door opened. A deep, sure voice called out, "Dad." I turned, and everything in me stilled. My eyes landed on him, and the only word that slipped out of my mouth before I could even think was, "Wow." Stuart wasn't just good-looking. He had that rare combination of youth and presence that demanded attention without trying. Tall, athletic, sharp blue eyes, dark hair falling effortlessly into place. He moved like someone entirely at ease in his own skin, shoulders back, steps unhurried, completely unself-conscious. His fitted black t-shirt left little mystery about how much time he spent at the gym. But it wasn't just his build, it was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to be announced. When his gaze met mine, something shifted. It wasn't the same as how I'd felt about Greg. This was immediate, visceral, a pulse of awareness I didn't want to name. I forced a polite smile. "You must be Stuart." He smirked slightly, eyes scanning me in a way that felt measured. "And you must be Rooney. Dad's told me a lot about you." I laughed lightly. "All good things, I hope." His smirk widened. "Guess we'll see." In the days that followed, I found myself noticing him more than I should have, the easy way he moved through the house, the sound of his laugh drifting from another room, the way his eyes sometimes caught mine with a spark that lingered a beat too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was all in my head. But one evening, Greg brought up the topic of Stuart's future over dinner. "He needs something to do," Greg sighed. "A job, a routine, something to get him thinking beyond just working out and hanging with friends." I hesitated before speaking. "Actually, we have a position open at my agency. It's nothing glamorous, but it's a start." Greg's brows lifted. "You do that for him?" I smiled. "Of course. I'd be happy to help." And I meant it. But deep down, there was more to it than I was willing to admit, even to myself. The next morning, I found Stuart in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his phone in hand. He was shirtless, something I was quickly realizing was a common sight, with a glass of water in front of him. "Morning," I greeted. He looked up with a faint grin. "Morning, Rooney. Coffee?" As I set about making it, I mentioned the job. "We were talking last night, about your plans." He chuckled. "Let me guess. Dad's worried I'm turning into a bum." I smiled faintly. "He just wants to see you find something you enjoy." His gaze narrowed slightly. "And you? Do you think I'm lazy?" I held his eyes a moment too long. "I think you haven't found the right opportunity yet." When I explained the opening at my agency, his expression shifted, surprise, curiosity. "You'd help me get it?" I shrugged. "I think you're capable of more than you think." That seemed to land with him. All right, he said. I'll give it a shot. 2 days later, he arrived at my office dressed neatly, fitted slacks, a crisp shirt, hairstyled. He drew glances from my colleagues as I introduced him to the team. And throughout the day, I noticed how easily he adapted, confident, likable, comfortable in any conversation. By the time we left that evening, something in the air between us had changed. At home that night, Greg was already half asleep in his recliner when I poured myself a glass of wine. The sound of footsteps made me turn. Stuart appeared, hair damp from a shower, towel slung casually over his shoulder. Pour me one, he asked. I hesitated, then filled his glass halfway. He took a slow sip, eyes on me. You didn't have to help me out today. But you did. Why? I met his gaze evenly. Because I think you have potential. A small smile curved his lips. You're an interesting woman, Rooney. I laughed softly. And you're an interesting young man, Stuart. It should have ended there. But it didn't. From then on, the moments between us seemed to grow heavier. In the office, our interactions carried a quiet undertone, an awareness we didn't acknowledge out loud. At home, it was more obvious, in the way he'd stand closer than necessary, the way his hand would brush mine in passing, the way his gaze would linger when Greg's attention was elsewhere. Greg never noticed. He trusted both of us. And that trust was what made everything so dangerously easy. One evening, Greg was upstairs in the shower while I was rinsing dishes. I felt Stuart's presence before I heard him, a closeness that made the air feel different. You've been different lately, he said quietly. I kept my eyes on the glass I was drying. How so? He didn't answer right away. Instead, his hand brushed lightly against mine as he reached for a plate. It was the kind of touch that could be dismissed as nothing. But we both knew it wasn't nothing. I finally looked at him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something unspoken. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back and picked up a towel. Later, in bed beside Greg, my skin still felt warm from where Stuart had been. The next time it happened, we were in my office going over reports. His voice was casual, but his eyes weren't. You get this little crease between your eyebrows when you're concentrating, he said. I arched a brow. And you've been studying me long enough to notice that? Maybe, he said, leaning back with a faint grin. We both knew this was no longer just harmless banter. And then came the night Greg left on a business trip. The house was quiet, too quiet. Stuart sat beside me on the couch, closer than necessary. You're quiet tonight, he said. Just tired, I replied. Liar, he murmured. Before I could respond, his fingers brushed lightly against my wrist, barely there, but enough to make my pulse quicken. The sound of a key in the lock snapped us apart. Greg walked in, smiling, none the wiser. And that's the thing, nothing had happened. Not really. But everything had changed. We had crossed into a space where words weren't needed, where the silences were louder than any conversation. And I knew, with a certainty that left me unsettled, that there was no going back.